Hi, I'm Rob Vischer. For the last few years, I've done lots of handyman work. Everything from building closets to fixing or replacing toilets. I respect the work, but I don't really like it. I ask God every day on every single job to give me a new career, please. While I'm not a big fan of what I've been doing for a living, there's an upside. I get to listen to a lot of podcasts. I listen to podcasts while I'm replacing light fixtures and doorknobs. I listen to podcasts while I'm patching drywall. And I'll listen to podcasts while I'm continually driving to and from Home Depot. Because of my habitual listening, I became a huge fan of Jordan Peterson, a Canadian psychologist with a fatherly pick yourself up by the bootstraps and make your bed type message. I've read the first chapter of his book about lobsters. I've paid to see his live tour on the Old Testament. I even tried to sneak backstage and meet him. It didn't work. I always knew, though, that Jordan was missing something. He looked at Jesus as kind of a truest of myths, like the perfect example of how any human should live a life of self-sacrifice. But he stopped there. On one of my handyman jobs, /Joe Rogan podcast binges, I heard Wes Huff, one of Joe's guests. Wes Huff is a Christian and an expert on ancient biblical texts who became famous for graciously debating and showing the ignorance of Billy Carson, a skeptic of Christianity. While discussing Jordan Peterson, Wes Huff graciously wordsmithed my concerns with Jordan. Here's Wes.
I think I really like the way that Jordan Peterson articulates it, but I think he misses the forest for the trees.
How so?
In that he sees Jesus as an archetype. And I don't think actually even Jesus gives you the opportunity to see him as the archetype. I have this love-hate relationship with all of Peterson's stuff because he seems to get so much right where he walks up to the line, but he doesn't want to cross over. He seems to think that the concept of Jesus as an example is more important than the actual flesh and blood first century itinerant Jewish preacher who was crucified and rose from the dead physically, which is the claim of the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament. That's an example for us to look on and live by. But I actually think that Jesus condemns moralism. And ultimately what I see Peterson doing is looking at Jesus as a moral example. And if Jesus is nothing but a moral example, then you can save yourself and you don't actually need a savior. And so I think actually Jesus would have critiqued that because Jesus was very against moralism.
In applying logic and comparing Jordan's teaching about Jesus with the claims Jesus makes about himself, Wes Huff clearly preaches the good news of Jesus Christ on Joe Rogan's podcast, the biggest podcast in the world. And when the good news of Jesus is clearly understood, it can become compelling even to people who think Christianity is a useful delusion.
I'm J. Warner Wallace, and my story in terms of how I ever got even interested in Christianity is, to be honest, I wasn't interested in Christianity. I had a great life. I was about 35 years old. I was working as an investigator in Los Angeles County. My father was a police officer before me, and he's a very committed atheist, and he would just tell you that. And I was raised by this guy to be much like him, and I ultimately ended up in the same job, same agency, where he was working in Los Angeles County. I started off as a patrol officer, worked gangs, worked SWAT, worked undercover. During much of that time, my wife was interested. Like, she was like, well, should we go to church? We have kids now. And when our kids were very young, we put them in a preschool that happened to be one was in a Baptist church, one was at a Catholic church, and we didn't know one from the other, really, to be honest with you. And she had a question. Now that our kids are getting close to school age, should we start attending church? And I thought, I wasn't raised this way, and I had really no interest. But I'm like my dad in this sense, that my dad's the kind of person who would be happy to go to church with you because he thinks it's a useful delusion. And he thinks if it'll help you raise your kids, great. He's not interested. I wasn't either. So when I first decided to say yes to my wife, Susie, that was really my thinking on it. I want to do what she wants to do. If it makes her happy, I'm happy to go. If it has some value, great. Doesn't have to have any value for me, in order for it to have value to her. So we end up in a church. Really the first time I've been in a church like this, an evangelical church, for anything other than like a funeral or maybe a wedding. And so I was just sitting there listening patiently, thinking I would endure this for as many times as she wanted to go. But this pastor was interesting in that he said that Jesus was the smartest man who ever lived. And that got me interested. So we didn't have a Bible, but I went out and bought one. It was a pew Bible. I just wanted to know, I didn't want to spend a lot of money on this, but I just wanted to know what was so smart about Jesus. So I'm reading through the Gospels to figure, I was kind of hoping it would be like proverbial statements, like fortune cookies, where I could just read the wisdom statements of Jesus, not knowing they're going to be embedded in what claims to be an historical account written and observed by eyewitnesses. When I read through the Gospels, I recognized that they were slightly different. Even the same episode would be described in a slightly different way. Sometimes the differences were severe enough that you would say, wow, is this a contradiction? Now, that provoked me because I have been interviewing witnesses by that time for many years, and I've never had two witnesses agree about a crime scene, ever. There's always some level of disagreement. And so that's just natural that you kind of expect that. As a matter of fact, the only thing I would ask if I was working a homicide I would ask the dispatcher to separate the eyewitnesses before I get there and keep them separated, because I want the differences in their story. Sometimes the differences are quite dramatic, and they actually are helpful for me. I get to puzzle those back together to bring back in some of the details you wouldn't have otherwise, especially if they got together and aligned their stories perfectly. So this difference between the Gospels provoked me. Now look, I knew how to test eyewitnesses. I don't trust eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses often lie. So I needed to know, are these reliable eyewitness accounts? Now remember, they're not all written. Look, when we do a cold case, and I look at a cold case, it's not as though the detectives back in the day asked the eyewitnesses to write down their own accounts. No, we interview them and we write a supplemental report of what the witness tells us. This is much like Luke does in the Gospel of Luke. I believe Mark is doing that as he's listening to Peter in Rome. And then, of course, Matthew and John are saying they are the eyewitnesses who are there. So I was starting off, I thought, in a pretty good place. I could test these eyewitnesses given the criteria that we use in criminal trials in the state of California. Strong criteria, 4 major categories. Were they there to see what they said they saw? Have they changed their story over time? Can they be corroborated, even in some small way? And finally, do they possess a bias that would cause them to lie to us? That was really it for me. I needed to know, did they pass that test? It took me about 9 months of going through those accounts, testing them under those 4 conditions. And I'll just tell you that they passed the test. So then what do you do with this Jesus guy? When the accounts seem to be reliable in every way that as a detective, I would test them. Now, this does not give you belief in. I did not have belief. I was not a Christian at this point. I was just somebody who believed that the Gospels were telling me something true about Jesus. But I still needed to turn a corner to move from belief that to belief in. You can believe that a plane can get you across the country, but until you enter that plane, you haven't put your trust in the plane, have you? No, I believed that these were reliable accounts, but I remember sitting with my wife and saying, hey, okay, so I've tested these. I think they're reliable, but I don't know if this is true. Why would God have to come and die on a cross? In other words, I was at a point where I trusted the gospel accounts, but still really did not understand the gospel. So what I stopped doing was reading the New Testament to see what it said about Jesus, because I'd already done that. I'd already tested it. Now I began to read the New Testament to see what it said about me. And as I was reading through those books, especially when you get to the books Paul writes to the Romans and to the Corinthian church, I realized that the New Testament was describing me exactly the way I am. I work cold case murderers. Okay, those are people who do a murder, and then for the next 30 years, they are just regular people. And they're living next door to you. They're the deacon at your church. I've arrested firefighters. I've arrested people who are upstanding citizens for the next 30 years. But they all had that capacity to do something terrible. This thing that Scripture describes perfectly, created in the image of God, so perfectly able to do delightful, wonderful things, yet so deeply fallen and rebellious that we are also capable of doing great evil. And I also knew that was true in my own heart. I knew that if there was a standard, I couldn't even abide by my own standard, let alone God's standard. So as I was reading through this in the letters of Paul, it struck me that I was exactly what the letters were saying, a sinner in need of a Savior. But I'd already done the heavy lifting to know that there was a Savior on the pages of the Gospels in the New Testament. So I simply had to connect those two dots. And I can remember exactly, I was working a surveillance in Southern California in Los Angeles County. I was probably 9 months into this investigation of the Gospels. And I was not on the eye of the surveillance. We had a perimeter up, and so our bad guy was not moving. So we were sitting on a perimeter waiting for him to move. And I was reading through the descriptions of the natural man and the spiritual man. And it dawned on me what the gospel was all about. The idea that if you do believe that God is just, he would have to punish wrongdoing. A God that wouldn't punish wrongdoing is not a just God at all. And I was a wrongdoer. And I knew that even as a police officer. So I knew that the only way to stand in front of a God like that was to have my wrongdoing punished. And when I realized that Jesus did that for me in advance and then rose from the grave to demonstrate who he was, I knew exactly where to place my trust. And that's really the way that I became a Christian. When people ask me today, well, why are you a Christian? I don't have a great testimony in the sense that I had this life of transformation. I had a great life. If you would have asked me at 34, how is your life going? I would say it's wonderful. I have no need. But I discovered that this was true. And then I was stuck with it. And there's many days when I'm thinking it's hard to live this life, especially in the culture that just seems like it's more and more aligned against you. But it is true. And wouldn't you rather live in an inconvenient truth than in a convenient lie? I know I would. And so that's why I haven't really flinched since this happened. And that's what I would say to you, that the more you know that something is evidentially true, the more likely you are to cling to it in a difficult situation. Because you know there's no place else to go. It's like Peter says, where else would we go? This happens to be true. So here we are. And that's, for me, that was my story of how I decided and discovered that was true and then decided to give my life to it.
After giving his life to the truth of the gospel, J. Warner Wallace wrote Cold Case Christianity. You can find it along with other books and articles at coldcasechristianity.com. J. Warner Wallace isn't just telling his story to sell books. He's telling his story for a different purpose.
As you write Christian apologetics books, you do get letters from people who will say that your book is the reason why I'm a Christian today. The gospel does all the work, okay? The only power is in the gospel. The power is not in my case, but it turns out a lot of people, when they hear the gospel, it sounds like blah, 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 because they've built these objections, these little walls they've built between themselves and the gospel based on their presuppositional biases, based on their skepticism, whatever it may be. So when we write books like this, books that really make a case for Christianity, often what we're simply doing is tearing down the stone walls that exist between people in their clear hearing of the gospel. They can hear the gospel, but they're not listening because they're distracted by their own objections. And what I hope that these kinds of books do is that they knock down those objections. But I'll just say this to anyone who's listening to this, that we have a tendency to think that there are these $1 million apologists, not that they're worth $1 million, because none of us are worth $1 million, but they're like very valuable. The church would say they're valuable, but to me, what we need is $1 million apologists. And that means that every one of us, if we take that book written by Peter seriously in 1 Peter 3, and we think we have a duty to defend what we believe, to give the reason for the hope we have in Jesus, if that is part of our DNA as Christians, then every one of us has a duty to be able to answer these questions. So let me just tell you, before I was ever an author or a public apologist for the Christian faith, I was a detective. But I believed that Christianity was true at some point, and I became a Christian, and then I knew how to defend it because I had walked through all of that for myself. And I remember I had a case, and it was a very traumatic case involving a girl who was probably like 22, murdered at a fast food restaurant. Her sister was probably around 13 at the time. By the time I met her sister, she was in her 30s. Her life had been frozen, completely frozen by the trauma of her sister's death. Her sister was the only Christian in the family. And she so admired her sister. And then she wondered, how could God take her sister, given that this is the one Christian in the family? This is somebody who had given her life since she became a Christian herself in her teenage years, had given her life to God. So her sister, the survivor, paralyzed her. Her entire family, they didn't celebrate holidays. Their health was declining. Really, once that young girl was killed, everyone who knew her, in the family at least, was devastated. Trauma is often simply described as this: when your worldview is completely shattered by an event that makes no sense under your worldview. And for this young lady, the sister who survived, she thought, if Christianity is true, why would God allow this? In other words, she was a Christian, but she had not thought through her Christian worldview robustly enough to make sense of any kind of evil. So my job as a detective was to solve the case. But for this young lady, it was to help her have a more robust Christian worldview that could answer the problem of evil. The most important work we did on that case was not convicting the killer, which we did, and it ended up on Dateline. But the most important work we did was helping her family to hold a version of Christianity that was robust enough to account for evil and give them hope for the future. I did that as a detective, just a guy. And if you're listening to this and you're not a published Christian apologist, good. You have a duty still as a Christian, though, to help the people in your world who are struggling because their worldview is not working. And the Christian worldview does. We need another $1,000,001 apologists who can help people who are struggling. And I think in the end, to me, that's far more important than what you might do writing a book. It's that individual encounter with people who need to understand, is this a reasonable worldview? Is this a worldview that makes sense, that can account for suffering, that can account for what we see in the world? We have to be prepared as Christians to be able to offer that answer.
J. Warner Wallace wants people to be equipped to give real answers to real people about real doubts that many real people have. In our next story, Dr. Tanya Paynter is one of those real people, and she begins to get frustrated with the incomplete and shallow answers that she's been given by many pastors.
In 2023, I underwent a pretty significant crisis of faith. I'd had questions about God and my faith and religion and all of that since I was a child, and never got any good answers to them. And I was a very science-minded person, and so when I would seek out answers from pastors and churches, I would always get kind of a pray more, read the Bible, which didn't really help to answer the questions that I had. So fast forward to about 2023, I was reading a book on other world religions just for information and just trying to understand some different points of view. And I remember sitting there thinking, wow, Christianity is just like all these other religions. Like, what is it that makes it true? There's nothing that makes it truer than what I'm reading about here. And in my heart, I was like, oh, that's a wrong thought, but my head couldn't let go of it. And so I just kept stewing on that. Like, how do we even know this is true? How is this any different than any other religion? Why do I think that Jesus rose from the dead? Like, that's probably just a myth. And so all these just intense doubts just flooded me. And I struggled with them for about 10 months. And the whole time, I went to church multiple times a week. Like, I had to be in the Word. I had to be around other believers to kind of carry me through this. And I remember praying, like, God, just help me to answer these questions. Like, get this out of my head, because my heart was still drawn to the Lord. Like, I knew the difference in my head versus my heart, right? I truly still believed, but I couldn't get those thoughts out of my head. And so I remember praying one night in bed and saying, God, I cannot get this, like, I can't do this anymore. It's too stressful. I was crying all the time. Like, it just was just terrible. And I prayed and I said, God, I can't do this anymore. This is it. If you are true and real, I need you to lift this doubt and make me know beyond any reason that you are true and the Lord, and I'm right in following you. And I fell asleep and I woke up the next day and every single doubt was gone. My rock solid faith ever since, like, never, I feel those little intrusive thoughts trying to break through and nothing. Like, nope, it's easy to dismiss now. And so within that same week, I had ordered some books on apologetics, which is the defense of the Christian faith, right? Giving a reason for why we believe what we believe. And And so I learned that there's this whole field of study about all of the questions that I had that never got a solid answer, which I still had, but now I knew that they weren't, they didn't discount the Lord just because I had these questions. And so I ordered a couple of books from Amazon, and I was reading through the back cover of one, and I saw that one of the authors was in charge of the Masters in Apologetics program at Colorado Christian University. His name is Ike Shepherdson. And I was like, wow, you can get a master's in this? That's cool. So I went to the computer and I was reading through what it entailed. And I was like, this is it. Like, this is covering everything that I've ever had questions about. And I could just feel from the Lord, like, this is what your next steps are. This is what you're to do. And so I prayed about it and I said, God, I don't know if I can do, like, you can get classes online. Do I really need another advanced degree in this? And besides, I'm a doctor and you can't really talk about religion so much in clinical visit. Like, how is this going to help? And he said, no, what I have for you is requires you to go through this program. I was like, okay. So I said, I don't understand. I don't get what I'm going to be doing with this, but I will trust you. And so I stepped into that program. And, the last barrier for me was, I don't know how I'm going to pay for this, Lord. Like, this was in 2023 and, things were starting to get tighter financially with everything going on. And I said, Lord, I need help with this. And I will back up a little bit because I have my own business. And from the get-go, he required that I put a certain amount of tithing away. And that was his fund. And over the years, like, I would pray, how do I spend this? Where do you want this? This is your money. What do I do with this? And he would tell me. And then silence for 2 years. He didn't have me say anything or give anything. And so I said, okay, well, it's starting to build up. Like, there's a pretty significant chunk in here. How can I give it to the church? No. Like, the answer was always no. And I was, all right, I don't know. So back to my story, when I asked for financial help from the Lord, he said, you're doing my work and following me with this program. And that's what that money in that account was for. And I will tell you, it was within $100, exactly what I needed for the entire 18-month course, including books and, everything else that was required. And that was when I said, wow, God, it just, knowing that he already had been preparing to provide for me if I was faithful in stepping out in what he was calling me to do.
Dr. Paynter not only received a master's in apologetics, she likes to research everything. In fact, when she kept suffering through migraine headaches for over a decade, she went to medical school. And now she helps women reduce the frequency and intensity of their headaches because she's been pain-free for 7 years. You can find out more at psalmmedical.com. Dr. Paynter went back to college to get her questions answered. But in our next story, Justin Brierley goes to college and gets his answers questioned.
I was born into a Christian family. Growing up in the UK, it's quite a secular environment. There aren't that many churches. So being a Christian kind of makes you stand out from the crowd somewhat. And I had plenty of secular, skeptical friends around me to keep me on my toes. But I had an experience in my teenage years that I just couldn't deny. It was an experience of God at a youth camp where suddenly the reality of God just came alive for me. I was kind of blasted by the Holy Spirit. And from that moment on, from the age of 15, I just knew there was a God. I knew he loved me. I wanted to read the Bible. I wanted to pray. I had one of those kind of road to Damascus moments where things just came alive for me. So I had this amazing experience of coming to know God through Jesus in that moment as a teenager. But a few years later, I found myself at Oxford University, where I was a student, an undergraduate studying politics, philosophy, and economics. And I found myself surrounded once again by people who were very skeptical about the Christian faith. Very few of the people I knew at my university were Christians, and lots of them were quite skeptical about Christianity. And so I ended up having a lot of conversations and being challenged very frequently about my faith by the people I was around. at university. It kind of had a difficult effect on me. There was at least one term when I was in that kind of undergraduate phase where I questioned everything. Maybe it was all in my mind. Maybe these people are true. There's no God. There's nothing out there beyond, the firings of our brain synapses and the chemicals and the DNA that makes us up. So I began to look for answers. And you know what? I found there were really good answers, it turned out. Because actually one of the people who had been at Oxford University 80 plus years before I had was a guy called C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is probably one of the best known Christian writers and thinkers of the 20th century. Many people know him for his Narnia books, but he was also a brilliant thinker. And he himself had a story of coming from atheism as a young man to becoming convinced that there was a God for philosophical, historical reasons. There's a famous story of him having a walk around Magdalen College gardens with J.R.R. Tolkien, who was one of his contemporaries. And he was discussing whether it made sense to believe that Jesus was really the Son of God. And J.R.R. Tolkien said, well, what if this is the one true myth? You love all those stories, C.S. Lewis, about the ancient gods and the pagan stories and so on. But what if there was one story that really is true, that all of those are just dim echoes of? And that convinced Lewis that actually he had found the true expression of God in Jesus Christ. And I suppose I went on a similar journey, realizing that actually you didn't have to throw your brain in the dustbin to be a Christian, that actually there was an incredible intellectual tradition in Christianity. Alongside C.S. Lewis, I started bumping into all kinds of modern Christian thinkers like William Lane Craig, well-known American philosopher who's done some amazing debates with Christians and atheists all over the world. In fact, as I progressed in my career after university, I began to explore this whole area of what's technically called Christian apologetics, the rational defense of the faith. I loved theatre as a young man. I wanted to do something that communicated, and so I moved into radio. I ended up presenting a radio show called Unbelievable for 17 and a half years, in which I brought together Christians and atheists to debate the big questions. Is there evidence for God? Can we make sense of the Bible? Did Jesus really rise from the dead? And I discovered in the process that there are really good reasons to believe in Christianity. I realized, in fact, that we all come to life with a worldview. A lot of people are under the impression that if you're a Christian, you have to provide all of the evidence and all of the argument to make someone believe that there is a God and that Jesus is his son. My atheist and skeptical friends also have a worldview. And when they came on the show, I was going to ask them questions about how they made sense of what they believe. Because most of the people who came on, who called themselves atheists, they believed that the universe essentially came from nowhere and was heading nowhere. There was no overarching purpose to life. And that raises all kinds of questions. How do you make sense of the fact we're here? I mean, why is the universe ordered in such a way as to allow human life in the cosmos? And what do we make of things like truth, beauty, justice, love? Can those really just be boiled down to chemical reactions in our brain? That didn't seem like the best way of looking at those questions to me. I realized that there are just as many questions that I need to have for my atheist friends as they should rightly have for me as a Christian. The question is, when we both look at the evidence that's available to us, whose story of reality makes the most sense? And I became increasingly convinced in hosting these conversations between atheists and Christians that actually Christianity can stand on its own 2 feet intellectually. It makes an awful lot of sense of things like, why do humans exist in the first place? When you look at the extraordinary complexity of the universe and the way in which it had to be set up in order for life to even be possible, that doesn't look like it makes sense on a purely naturalistic, atheistic worldview where it's all down to chance. It looks as though we were meant to be here. There's a grand designer behind the whole thing. So I thought, human existence, that seems to point towards rather than away from God. And then I looked at the question of human value. Rather than looking out there at the universe, looking within and asking, why do we believe in human rights? Why do we believe in dignity? Why do we believe that every human has equal worth? If we're just one more random outcome of a unguided process of evolution, then we have no particular right to say we're more special than anyone else. But actually, if we're all made in the image of God, then that kind of makes sense of that intrinsic belief most of us have, that humans do have this intrinsic worth and value and dignity. It makes sense of the fact that we create whole documents of human rights. Again, human value seems to point towards rather than away from God. And finally, I thought about human purpose. What's the point of life? Why are we here? Again, the atheist story of reality is one in which there is no ultimate purpose. One day, the universe will be extinguished in terms of its usable energy. We're running out of a story to make sense of anything on the atheist worldview. That didn't make sense to me as a Christian. I believe that actually when I look at the universe, I see hope, I see truth, I see purpose in all kinds of ways. And the person I think who gives us the greatest hope is Jesus Christ. That story of reality in which there is a God and he came to be with us in person and he gave his life for us so that we could experience true life with him. That made more sense to me than the purposeless story of reality that I found on atheism. So when I look at human existence, human value, human purpose, all of those seem to point towards rather than away from God. Now, I've met many really intelligent atheists, and I always want to have good conversations with them. I don't want to dismiss them. But when I look at the story of reality that we're both invested in, it seems to me that God is a better explanation of things than a purely material, non-physical, random, chaotic almost story of reality on atheism. In the course of hosting these conversations, I ended up writing this book, Why I'm Still a Christian, in which I've tried to give some of the reasons why we can believe and why we can make sense of faith, and also to answer some of the key objections. I experienced many of those questions as I hosted these conversations, not least the question of the problem of suffering and evil. If there is a good God, why does he allow so much suffering and evil in the world? It's a great question. There are no easy answers to those kinds of questions. But in the end, I find that you've got two choices. Either suffering and evil is a mystery that we have to accept and trust in God for, or it's simply meaningless. That's the problem. On an atheistic worldview, there isn't a good answer to the problem of suffering and evil either. It's just completely meaningless. It's just whatever happens, hard luck. I'd rather believe actually in a universe where even if I don't have all the answers, I can trust in a God who does have the ultimate answers. And a God who actually came in person to experience pain and suffering with us, who on the cross knew what it is to suffer. And that may be the best answer someone can have when they're in the midst of suffering, to know that God knows how they're feeling, because God came to be one of us. I've also encountered many people who have been on a similar journey to me. Very often, they are Christians who perhaps were shaken in their faith or lost their faith altogether because they ran into some of the so-called new atheists in their books. Richard Dawkins is a well-known atheist in the UK, and his best-selling book, The God Delusion, in the mid-2000s, was part of a movement known as New Atheism, trying to persuade people to abandon their beliefs. Well, I actually give thanks to God for Richard Dawkins, because he has prompted so many interesting conversations about faith since writing that book. And I actually know people, believe it or not, who have become Christians because they read that book, ironically. It was precisely because he was raising these questions that it made them go away and actually investigate. One of them is a good friend of mine called Peter Byram. Now, he was raised in a Christian family, but he had kind of lost his Christian faith by the time he went to university. He read Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, and he thought, that's it, I don't need to believe in God. It's all a fairy tale. End of story. But then, Peter was confronted by two housemates, one of whom was a very devout atheist, but one of whom became a very radical Christian during his time at university, and he found he couldn't escape the God question as easily as he'd hoped. So he decided, maybe I ought to go and start watching some YouTube videos to see what this is all about. And so he went and watched some of those videos by the atheists, and he found them quite convincing. But he heard them referring to one or two Christian thinkers, so he thought, well, I might as well go and see what the Christian thinkers are saying about this as well. And so he started to watch people like William Lane Craig and Professor John Lennox, an Oxford professor of mathematics and science, Christian thinkers making the case for why it might make sense to believe in God. And he suddenly ran into arguments he'd never really heard before. Arguments from science and philosophy and history arguments that questioned atheism and arguments that seemed to make actually better sense of the God hypothesis. He suddenly found himself conflicted. Maybe I'd dismissed God too easily. Maybe I'd only really read one side of the argument. He went on a journey over several years that brought him into my path. He started listening to my show, listening to these conversations between atheists and Christians. He even helped to arrange a debate and speaking tour with William Lane Craig in the UK. He ended up becoming good friends with William Lane Craig. And it was on that tour in 2011 that he finally made the decision to become a Christian. He realized he'd been intellectually persuaded by the case for God and Christianity. He just needed to take the emotional step, the heart step of actually putting his trust in Jesus Christ. And he did it during that tour. I today work with Peter. He's a very close colleague of mine as we continue to host conversations and create podcasts, books, media and events, helping others to explore faith and to find a thinking faith for themselves. And I've seen hundreds more people go on that journey. It's evidence that you don't have to throw your brain in the trash can to be a Christian. Christianity has always been about the head and the heart. Yes, we certainly need to believe things with our heart. It's good to have experiences that remind us there's a God and that he speaks to us in all kinds of ways. But let's not abandon the head either, because Jesus told us to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, and mind. We've been given a mind, and actually when we use it, we find that the fingerprints of God are all over our universe and within us as well. I believe it makes perfect sense to be a Christian, and we can be confident in our faith. And we can go out and have confident conversations with people who maybe don't share our faith. That's okay, because in the scriptures, we're told to always be ready to give a reason, an answer to anyone who asks you about the reason for the hope that we have, but to do it with gentleness and respect. So that's my story, and I hope it's helped you.
Funny or quirky sayings on church signs have made me want to groan, but they've never made me want to go to church. But if I saw a church sign with, "We're not afraid of your questions," I might walk in. I love to listen to people who aren't afraid of questions. That's why I like podcasts like Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, and that's why I love to listen to Wes Huff. I don't love being a handyman, but I do love how listening to honest conversations about Christianity has strengthened my faith. If you have questions, send them to us. We'd love to connect you with the right ministries and resources. We're not afraid of your questions because God isn't afraid of ours. The logical and scientific proof of Jesus and the good news of the gospel makes me say, "Wow, God." And when I say wow, God, I mean the one true living God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's the one who makes my heart say,
"Wow, God."
Wow, God.
Wow, God.
My wow God story.
I wanted to share a wow God moment.
That's my wow God story. Praise God.
And I'm so thankful to God for this wow God moment.
So, thank you, God.